The National Board of Forensic Medicine decided to age test 581 migrant children, and it turns out that 76% of those tested are above the age of 18. This created shockwaves through the Swedish media. And the most amazing part is that this is considered news. We knew about this shit like 5 years ago. This has been a well-established fact for a really long time. And this is exactly why the alternative media is winning. Because the mainstream media reports reality 5 years after it's happened. Denmark, 2012. Out of 637 unaccompanied refugee children, 51% were above the age of 18. Norway, 2015. They tested 877 children. 34% of them were at least 18 years of age. In Finland that same year, 149 children were tested. 62% of them were adults. In 2016, they tested 630 children and 65% were adults. And in Denmark of 2016, 800 children were tested and 74% were above the age of 18. Do I need to go on? Why would Sweden be any different? In fact, this has been Sweden's worst kept secret for years. People who work with migrants at asylum houses, schools, the migration board, etc. They've known about this for sure, but many wouldn't speak up in public because they were afraid of losing their jobs. Because that's just the type of country that Sweden is. The truth will get you fired and socially ostracized. This despite the fact that all anyone really had to do to understand that something isn't quite right here was just take a look at them. Does this guy look like he's 17 years old to you? Does he look like a man that should attend the same classes as young girls? Does this guy look like he's 17? I don't buy that this guy is 14 years old. And I don't buy that this guy is 16 years old. And I don't buy that this guy is a teenager either. But I'm just a big old racist apparently, because all of us who objected to this farce were called racist, both by the right and the left. The Nationalist Party, the Sweden Democrats, are the only ones who've had some integrity in this issue. They're the only ones who cared about the facts. And the real irony here is that the people who hate them the most refuse to acknowledge this, and then they end up stealing their ideas anyway.
Det kan inte vara rimligt att Sverige som en liten nation ska ta emot 25% av alla som kommer till EU. Vi är det land i Europa som tar emot flest ensamkommande, så kallade ensamkommande flyktingbarn. Och det är ett problem. Och problemet är att den svenska regeringen för en ansvarslös flykting- och invandringspolitik. Och det dränerar stora ekonomiska resurser från välfärdssamhället. Och vi måste givetvis, det finns inget träd där vi kan plocka pengar.
För det här, vad heter du då? Margret heter jag. Och det här visar bara vilken människosyn du har. Vi pratar om barn. Gör vi. Vi pratar om, vi pratar om barn och vi pratar om den gruppen i vårt land som är den allra sköraste gruppen som kommer från krig där västvärlden har varit och bombat. Det är Sverige bland annat med och ställer till de här krigen. Det handlar om barn, det handlar om
vi ska vara försiktiga med vad vi använder för begrepp, för faktum är att det är oftast inte barn som kommer. I våra nordiska grannländer där man har infört åldersbestämningstester så visar det sig att från 48 till 73% är det inte barn utan det är vuxna unga män som kommer. Och det är också en av anledningarna till att trenden är minskande i våra grannländer medan den är ökande i Sverige. För en ansvarsfull invandringspolitik så har det inte varit några problem heller.
Det här handlar om barn. Det handlar om barn. Du pratar för fan alltså. Nej, jag försöker prata också. För du slutar aldrig.
Ställer upp och tar emot ett ensamkommande
man får börja snacka om mänsklighet. Man får börja prata om värdegemenskap. Man får börja prata om barnkonventionen.
Kan du lugna ner dig? Kan jag avsätta en diskussion här?
Demokrater respekterar varandras åsikter, olika åsikter. Man stöter och blöter
åsikter. Men du respekterar inte flyktingbarn.
Men du kan inte diskutera med civiliserad ton.
So, looking at this now in retrospect, what really happened here? Well, we didn't accept many children at all. We allowed adult liars to steal the places of actual children who are starving and dying. And some of these adult imposters cosplaying as refugees rewarded Sweden by raping young girls. There's way too many articles of so-called unaccompanied children raping Swedish girls. The number of cases is staggering. In fact, the influx of so-called children, primarily from Afghanistan, had the effect that bathhouses and music festivals became hotbeds for sexual assault. All of a sudden, group molestations became a widespread phenomenon in Sweden, and the official police report said that 80% of perpetrators were newly arrived migrants. Look at this fucking picture. Look at this adult male sitting in another grown man's lap, pretending to be a kid, and everyone is just playing along in this perverse illusion. This image typifies the psychosis of political correctness. Sweden's politicians placed grown men together with young girls in schools and on school buses, which had a consequence of these young girls being molested and raped. And still, Swedish municipalities carry out projects such as refugee children paired up with Swedish girls at riding schools. Oh, just let them dip their dicks. This is great for integration. This man travels around Sweden holding lectures at schools about sexual harassment. In several places he's visited, young girls approached him to tell him about the migrants harassing them both in school and outside of school, to the point where they don't feel safe in school anymore. They've even stopped walking home alone after school. But when they tell the school staff about this, they're called racist. Do not tell me that political correctness is harmless. It's actively ruining people's lives. This is what happens when you put white guilt over common sense. Sweden is what happens when bullshit rhetoric about post-colonialism gets to dictate everything around immigration. Sweden is what happens when you decide to run a country as a corporate brand instead of a society where you're responsible for the well-being of your citizens. And in the city of Uppsala, these so-called children are responsible for a majority of robberies in the city this past year. This in order to finance their heroin use. And they don't have a problem assaulting senior citizens either. Not that Swedish politicians would care very much, because Sweden hates old people. 90-year-olds were kicked out of their apartments to make room for refugee children. And a daughter to one of the elderly talked about how her mom just kept crying. She's become really depressed because of this, and she said, and I quote, "I'm just waiting for death at this point." This is how Sweden treats the generations that built Sweden. And Swedish youths aren't treated much better either. Those with serious issues are denied placement at halfway houses because they would rather take in refugees instead. Now, a migrant man cosplaying as a refugee child costs Sweden anywhere from 3,000 to 16,000 crowns per day. Keeping this in mind, let's put things into perspective. For 50 crowns, you can buy school lunch for a child in Uganda for a whole month. For 200 crowns, you can buy an entire class in Afghanistan, pen and papers. 200 crowns in Senegal can treat 64 children suffering from pneumonia. And the Red Cross food package, which costs 385 crowns, can last a family a whole month in refugee camps near Syria. Despite this, Sweden decreased their funding to international humanitarian aid in order to be able to pay for asylum reception in Sweden instead. In 2015, they took 8.2 billion crowns from the aid budget and put it on asylum seekers in Sweden. And they decided this after the UN said that due to a lack of funds, they had to cancel food and water for 360,000 refugees near the conflict area. So Sweden literally took food out of the mouths of starving children in Africa and the Middle East in order to prioritize a group of imposters who are here for financial reasons. I want the entire world to know that Sweden doesn't give a shit about refugees nor children. Nobody who genuinely cares about real refugees would make these kind of insane priorities. So-called refugee children alone cost more than all of Sweden's police force, and the expense for men cosplaying as refugee kids makes out nearly half of the entire budget for migration. In 2016, Swedish mass immigration cost 73 billion crowns. And this is after we took in about 160,000 people. UNHCR's budget for 70 million refugees worldwide that very same year was 65 billion. They only raised half. So what this means is that UNHCR, who are trying to take care of 70 million people globally, needed less money than what Sweden does to conduct our insane immigration policy. How can anyone seriously say that we care about refugees? 5 so-called refugee youths from Afghanistan raped a young boy under the age of 15, who is also from the same country. The rape was violent and occurred for more than an hour. What was their sentence? Well, the court deemed their actions worthy of 6 years in prison, but since they claimed to be under the age of 18, they were rewarded with only 1 year in prison each, and deportation for 10 years, after which they're allowed to return. This brings up another problem with these migrant con artists. Whenever they lie about their age, they get their sentences reduced severely for brutal crimes like rape. And they get to spend time in a relaxed, cozy juvie instead of a prison. And these gang rapes of boys by migrant men is a thing in Sweden now. There's been several cases, all thanks to the migration from Afghanistan. A reason given by the media is cultural attitudes. How are we supposed to buy the bullshit idea that all cultures are equal? And let's not forget the resistance to age testing from the Doctors Association. They claimed that age testing migrants is unethical, since the methods cannot determine exact age. Which is true, the methods don't determine exact age. They can just tell us whether someone is above or below the age of 18. And I suppose that's completely worthless information when trying to decide who counts as a kid, huh? It's pretty bad when even the doctors of your country are brainwashed by social justice propaganda. And it's really interesting how doctors in Denmark and Finland don't have any problems doing age testing. So imagine the nerve of the Swedish Doctors Association, basically implying that Denmark and Finland are unethical, incompetent morons. Let us also mention the president of Sweden's Lawyer Association, who, along with some other top lawyers, said that age testing migrants is unacceptable and pure blackmail of vulnerable people. But really, these capitalist pigs are just upset because asylum cases are a gold mine for lawyers. It's a never-ending stream of job opportunities, and they're basically getting rich off of Sweden's irresponsible migration policy. This woman makes 2 million a year. She lives in one of the nicest neighborhoods in Sweden, where none of the consequences of the government's migration policy are noticeable. She literally said that Swedish senior citizens should give up their welfare to accept more migrants into Sweden. Nobody with a functioning sense of empathy would say something like that. This is not about humanitarianism, and this is not about caring for people. This is all about profit. And of course, our left-wing government isn't gonna do anything about this problem. In response to the news that I brought up in the beginning of this video, the Minister of Finance said point blank that none of the illegitimate residence permits that have been handed out to those who lied about their age will be revoked. Unlike Norway's government, who decided to take back residence permits, Sweden admits that mistakes have been made, but they don't want to actually do anything to fix these mistakes. The Red and Green coalition are just wasting billions in taxpayer money, and not only that, they also enforced a decision that essentially incentivizes refugees to fail in school, because now you can get your residence permit extended in order to finish school. So anyone who fucks up in school gets to stay longer. Now, this is where things get really perverse. Are you ready? First things first. We have an interesting phenomena in Sweden called batikhäxa. which roughly translates to tie-dye witch. Batik is a technique of coloring clothing that was developed by the Javanese people in Indonesia and then culturally appropriated by Swedish hippies in the 70s. The result can be similar to tie-dye, with the exception that batik uses beeswax as a coloring resistant, instead of merely tying up clothing and then pouring colors onto them. So the technique is different, but in Sweden the two terms and techniques have become synonymous with time. Now this is where it gets really exotic. Batik hag as an insult was actually invented before social justice warrior became a popular negative slur. And you could say that the tie-dye hag is a type of social justice warrior. But there's different criteria. The person needs to be a woman who's at least 30 years old and evidently doesn't care about her appearance, since she dresses in moderated semi-hippie clothing with earthy tones, while she works in a public sector like the welfare office or the migration board. When it comes to public debates, she's a politically correct steamroller that will shout like an elephant if someone questions open borders. The way I see it, what makes this creature different from the ordinary social justice warrior is the way that they'll distinguish themselves not only with appearance but also with profession. These people are usually in positions of power and thus legitimized by the state. A tie-dye hag will most typically be a social worker, preschool teacher, or some pseudo-exotic job in the cultural sector where she praises sculptures of women's vaginas made with ecological clay. In her mind, every problem is socio-economical. The individual never has any responsibility, and she'll praise the multicultural ghettos while making sure to live in an all-white neighborhood. These women are more emotional than rational, and it should be noted that not all leftist women qualify as batik hags. A certain amount of hysteria is required, which is nearly exclusive to Swedish women who spread their legs through open borders. You could say that Sweden's uniquely suicidal immigration policy creates the batik bitch by egging on an already unstable, over-emotional brain found in certain parts of the population. The bohemian hag and our political system exist in symbiosis, and these people are everywhere in our government, city halls, welfare offices, and the media. However, I find that tie-dye witch is kind of a boring term. It doesn't feel nearly as catchy as the Swedish original batikhexa. I'm trying to think of what a better translation would be. Perhaps social justice cock goblin. Okay, that's a bit vulgar maybe. I just really like the word cock goblin. I feel like it should be used way more often. Sounds like some evil dick-sucking entity. Which is a pretty good way of describing these women, because that's exactly what they're doing to migrants right now. These type of women have become a living meme on the internet because of their ridiculous over-the-top immigration activism, which more than anything seems rooted in the undying passion for colored cock. The social justice cock goblin can be found bragging on social media about their enormous humanism and how much they love taking care of their refugee boys. This vagina-oozing group of social workers operate under the hashtag and organization called We Can't Take It, meaning they can't stand the idea of their boy toys being taken away from them. Their entire purpose is to make sure that single men, primarily from Afghanistan, who claim to be children, aren't age-tested or deported, even when they lack IDs or valid asylum claims. It's funny how much effort they spend wanting to import these young men, and not the girls of Afghanistan, who are treated far, far worse than any man down there. Oh, we're so PC that we leave starving children living in repressive archaic conditions in their war-torn countries, but import Mandingo under the guise of child so he can satisfy my old dried-up snatch and my loathsome personality that scared away my husband years ago. 20 migrants were deported back to their home countries, which caused around 60 of these women to carry out a loud demonstration where they ended up crying, screaming, and holding signs saying, "Sweden kills!" You do realize that these men were deported because they were lying about their age and weren't actual refugees. So you're actually arguing for adult migrants to be given the places reserved for actual refugee children. See what I mean with batik bitch being a really Swedish phenomenon? Where else could political correctness infect someone this severely? Things became exceptionally absurd when two of these activists were interviewed by the media. One of them referred to an unaccompanied migrant as her son, and the other started breaking up in tears when she told the story of her poor refugee boy and how he got his age written up and his application rejected and became homeless when he went underground as an illegal and then was caught by police and locked up in custody like an animal, like a prisoner. Of course he got locked up. That's what happens when you lie about your age and get your application rejected because you didn't have valid asylum reasons, and then you run away from your deportation sentence to live as an illegal. Of course the cops are gonna put you in a cage. But nah, she just has to start crying over spilled cock. You filthy old Sumka! Why don't you spread your legs for the fine migrants, eh? Those who work jobs and try learning the language? Why didn't you reward those blokes instead of shagging charlatans, eh? Say hello to fucking Sherlock. Now that's a fuck nigger face if I ever saw one. You know this guy's getting ready to dip. You know he's got the fucking tip in. He's just waiting to squeeze in another 15 inches. I'm not even gonna hate on you, bro. You got shit made. You got that pussy on lock. This is the face of success. This is a man who fell through the cracks of Swedish generosity and landed in a moist cave everyone thought was long lost to menopause. This guy fucks, okay? This guy fucks. What Sweden has essentially done here is the biggest import of gigolos throughout human history, and then letting taxpayers pick up the bill for this immoral fuckfest and then call that humanism. This is not a migrant crisis. Okay? This is a globalized brothel. A debate article was published where a migration activist shares her story. She vividly paints a picture of how she picked up this traumatized, quiet refugee child at the train station, and when they arrive at her place, she gives him a sandwich and lets him sleep on her couch. Then she writes, "More visits were made. He's placed in special housing belonging to the migration board, but every once in a while he gets to spend the night at my place. Now, the couch doesn't work anymore. He gets to come along into my bed. I text a friend of mine saying, 'Help! I need to have him in my bed!' The reply I get says, 'Hey, that's completely fine. We all do it. That's just the way it is. Give him intimacy. That's what you can do for him. That's what you can do for him.' So I give him intimacy, and he holds me in a vice so tight that it hurts." She's basically describing grooming, and she's completely oblivious to it. And this is far from the only case. At a refugee house in northern Sweden, a female employee was found having sex with one of the so-called children. In another city, same thing there. Yet another case in Kramfors. It also happened in Karlskrona, it happened in Norrbotten, in Jönköping County, it happened in Väsby, in Sjuhärad, in Blekinge, it happened in the north of Sweden, it happened in mid-Sweden, it happened in the west, and it happened in the south. Here's an employee in Åmål giving a refugee kid a lap dance, and here's yet another case where the owner of an asylum house decided to suck migrant dick. I can go on, and you might think that what I said was crazy, but I'm not taking it out of thin air. And in one case, things went exceptionally far. A very hot topic in the media right now is the Arboga woman, a former social worker who ran a home for so-called refugee children. The profit was immense. For a single migrant, she would charge 100,000 crowns per month in taxpayer money. Drugs and alcohol flowed within these walls, and she abused her position of power to force the young men to have sex with her. She said that if they didn't do it, she'd contact the migration board and have them deported. She raped them and recorded everything with a camera. When two of the men were interviewed by the media, they said that they agreed to it because neither police nor social services would help them. They also found the ordeal to be extremely embarrassing because in their home country, sex outside of marriage carries the punishment of death. Charges were pressed against the woman, but the investigation was later dropped. And shortly after this, the 2 rape victims were violently assaulted by 10 men who forced their way into their apartment. The victims said that they recognized 2 of the perpetrators. They were the woman's migrant boyfriend and a partner to one of her children. And it doesn't end there. As I mentioned, she has a migrant boyfriend. These 2 met when he was living at her asylum house for unaccompanied children, and he's been pointed out as one of the 10 men who assaulted those 2 other migrants that were raped by her. Some say that her boyfriend is 19 years of age, others say that he's actually 25, but you know how that goes. After the attack on her rape victims, she convinced her refugee boy toy to kill her own mother and father, promising him marriage, money, and a future in Sweden as a reward. The mother actually survived this attack, and as soon as she came to, she said that her daughter was most likely responsible. The Arboga woman is also suspected of murdering her ex-husband in 2015. Even though they were separated at the time, she took out a life insurance, and this happened right before he had a mysterious drowning accident that made no sense. He was a very good swimmer, and yet he was found drowned in 1 meter deep water. In addition to this, she had threatened to hang him by a tree on a prior occasion, and on several different occasions she tried to convince various people to kill him, including 2 of her daughters. In total, she has 6 children with 3 different men. She claims to be innocent to all of these murders and shifted the blame to other people, including her son. She also tried to bribe her children into taking the fall, offering them 1 million as a reward if they would take responsibility for the murders. Her motives for these murders all appeared to be money. Apparently she was living well above her assets and was often taken care of financially by her parents, who even bought her an apartment. Her mother thinks that the murder was revenge because they didn't want to sell her the family cabin. The Arboga woman apparently hated both her parents, her mother slightly more than her father, and she also hates men. On one hand, she's had many relationships with them, but she said that these were always lacking emotional commitment and were more attempts at fitting in and living up to the parents' expectations. The trial is currently underway. And after all of this, we get a fucking article in Sweden's biggest left-wing paper celebrating this female piece of shit. Let me quote what this says. Beyond the disgust we feel towards her actions, I also sense a pinch of envy. Not for the pain that she's caused her victims and their families, but for her lack of boundaries. I see a woman who doesn't have the usual barriers that keep people from living out their immediate needs and fantasies. A woman who lets herself fall for temptation without thinking of the consequences. A woman who satisfies her urges. Who hasn't dreamt of letting go every once in a while? To dare, without thinking, oh, but that's not very good. But luckily enough, you never dare to. But she dares. She gets 6 children and forms a clan where she's the leader. The fathers of the children appear to be secondary creatures. She starts a corporation in a controversial but lucrative business where she exploits her position of power for sex. She consumes far above her assets, knowing that someone else will sort her shit out for her. While everyone else is satisfied fantasizing about revenge, she actually acts upon it. Nobody fucks with her unpunished. She demands immediate satisfaction. Her borderless life disgusts and thrills. We're scared by her while simultaneously being dazzled and allured. What does that say about us? Do we really want to know? Yeah, I like to know why you're celebrating a rapist murderer too, and why you seem to be doing it because her victims were men. Is this really what feminism has come to? I just can't imagine this type of tribute being published in the mainstream media about Anders Breivik or Ted Bundy. But maybe that's just my crazy old prejudice speaking. Now, let's really put things into perspective here. Imagine that 35,000 young women from the Ukraine arrive in Sweden as refugees, say that they're a couple of years older than they really are, and attract tons of attention from older Swedish men who flock around them and revel in them and want to hug them and take care of them. How do you think the feminists would have reacted? how do you think that the media and the general public would have reacted? That's a particularly disgusting aspect to all of this. The double standards, right? The hypocrisy. If we had taken this situation and reversed the genders, accusations of pedophilia and human trafficking would have been raining. But since it's women being creepy, they get a fucking hashtag and the media presents them as activists, not perverts. Last but certainly not least, I want to offer a solution to all this mess. Expressen is a bullshit mainstream paper who spent many years publishing fake news about immigration. They claimed that migrant children were actually children. Now when they realized that racist news are more profitable, they interviewed a migrant who admits to lying about his age. He says that, "I'm 22 years old, but in Sweden I'm 17. And he talks about how he left Sweden with a return allowance of 30,000 crowns, which brought up a good point to me. Here's my simple suggestion to solve all these problems. Make it mandatory by law to age test every single migrant claiming to be a child. Revoke residence permits for everyone who's a stinking liar and deport them. As for those who already have residence permits, who are above 18 and whose age checks out, create incentives for them to return to their home countries. Give them an allowance of, let's say, 50,000 Swedish crowns if they promise to never revisit Sweden. That money will go a really long way in their home country, and it would be far, far cheaper than the many millions Sweden would have to spend in order to keep housing them here. The way I see it, this situation could easily be resolved if the politicians only wanted to. Why don't you spread your legs for the fine migrants, eh?